Tonight on Nation to Nation, NDP MLA Betty Nippi-Albright is just one of more and more Indigenous people speaking out against Indigenous identity fraud.
They need to be charged because that's fraud. Fraud is fraud. And how many of these pretendians have gained scholarships, have won awards?
Métis lawyer Jean Teillet says more needs to be done. The consequences have begun to happen.
There should be consequences, and so far there have been. Like, you know, people are losing their awards. We've seen them taking the awards away from Dr. Tupel.
Hip-hop artist Plex says it's not a new phenomenon.
I was aware even back then in the 80s that there were people who were abusing, certain, services that were allocated for marginalized people.
Ani Bojo, welcome to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. It seems like every month someone is questioned about their Indigenous identity, about how people are claiming indigeneity with little or no Indigenous ancestors in their background, and using it to further their personal and professional careers. Indigenous people and groups are increasingly speaking out about this. Now politicians are joining those voices. Last month, Senator Mary Jane McCallum asked the Senate to examine and report on the misrepresentation of Indigenous ancestry. On February 14th, she delivered a 15-minute speech introducing the work of the Indigenous Women's Collective to the Senate floor.
Colleagues, I stand with the Indigenous Women's Collective in denouncing the deceit of Indigenous identity theft. Its tentacles reach every level of academic, political, judicial, and policy branches of power.
Joining me now is NDP MLA for Saskatchewan Centre, Betty Nippi-Albright. Last week, she asked the Saskatchewan government to take action against so-called pretendians. She joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much for having me today.
You just heard a clip from Senator McCallum. Is she correct? Is Indigenous identity theft that widespread?
Absolutely. It is in every organization, institution in Saskatchewan, as well as across Canada. It's very much at the federal corrections, provincially, government, academia. It is everywhere. And it has been going on for so long. And we finally are able to start calling these pretendians out. And because this is an act of colonial violence against Indigenous people.
What are the harms that these pretendians do?
Well, not only are they taking up space where they ought not to, they're taking up space and making decisions about us as Indigenous people. When you have a high number of false Indians taking up space in these high-level positions and making these decisions, it creates a lot of harm. As Indigenous women, it's even worse for us because we fight as educated Indigenous women to have our voices heard. And when we have pretendians taking up that space, it makes it that so much harder for us. And that is wrong. We have to stop and end colonial violence against Indigenous people in this country.
Why did you feel you should call on the provincial government to verify the status of civil servants?
Well, I knew for a long time that there were many pretendians out there. And when we started calling out, and I'm part of the Indigenous Women's Collective, when we started calling this out, we called it out because it's our daughters. We have to do this for our daughters, for our granddaughters, for those not yet born. We already know today, as educated women, it's very hard for us to get our voices heard. And when we have these individuals claiming to be Indigenous and falsifying their indigeneity, it harms us. So it is important. And I knew that at the provincial level that we have whether it's in corrections, whether it's in governments, in our own government, we have pretendians. And this is not about Indigenous people and designated positions. This is about anyone claiming to be Indigenous and benefiting off our backs, and that is wrong.
But it isn't just as easy as asking someone for proof, for a card. So how do you work through that when some people who are legitimately Indigenous don't always have those cards on hand either? How do you tell the difference?
If you don't have a status card or a Métis card, it's easy to establish, it would be easy to establish your connection to that community. And so there's processes out there. And in Saskatchewan, I've been calling out to the government to have all self-identified Indigenous people sign an attestation form so that they are saying they are who they are and that they can prove it.
Is this an approach every province should take?
Well, I know in Saskatchewan, I guess what I do understand, this is not something that's we're not reinventing the wheel. We know that Corrections Canada is already doing that. We know that organizations are already doing that. So this is an approach, I know in Saskatchewan, and I can only speak for Saskatchewan, that this is something that can work and we can do it. We've done it when COVID happened and we had to have healthcare workers provide proof that they were vaccinated. So it's something that is doable, and it's something that can be implemented today. And I've asked our government to do that. Like, as MLAs, there's no designated Indigenous seat, yet there's a few of us saying we are Indigenous. And I've said, I can demonstrate that I am a treaty person. I can show you my government issued card that says I am who I am.
Mm-hmm. You have said those who make false claims should be terminated. How do you feel about them being charged criminally with identity fraud, as suggested by Cree lawyer Leah Ballantyne?
I think that fraud is fraud. And when non-Indigenous people claim to be Indigenous and are frauding any system, yes, I agree. They need to be charged because that's fraud. Fraud is fraud. And how many of these pretendians have gained scholarships, have won awards and monetary awards as well? They should be taken away. Those awards need to be taken away and not given back freely and said, oh, I apologize, I made a mistake. That's not good enough. What we're saying is charge them, because fraud is fraud. And they need to be held accountable. A simple apology just doesn't cut it, because the damage that has been done to Indigenous people across this country is horrible. It's horrific. That's an act of colonial violence that's happening today, not 100 years ago, today. And those individuals need to be held to account. And employers need to stand up and start protecting their Indigenous employees.
Can you okay, that's good right there. Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Miigwech for having me.
Coming up after the break, we'll hear from Métis lawyer Jean Teillet and her thoughts on identity fraud. Welcome back. As we heard before the break, the issue of Indigenous identity fraud is everywhere, infecting professions from the arts to civil servants to academia. Meanwhile, skeptics are more and more concerned about how to stop this identity fraud from happening. It's a conflict Métis lawyer and author Jean Teillet knows well. She wrote an 85-page report about it for the University of Saskatchewan that was released last October. It examines the harms identity fraud causes and outlines the red flags to watch for and suggests prevention measures pleasures. Joining me now from Vancouver is Jean Teillet. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Glad to be here, Annette.
So what does it tell you when there are serious questions about the Indigenous identity, about someone as well known and respected as lawyer and child advocate Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond?
Well, she's by no means alone in this, right? We have a very recent example at Memorial University in Newfoundland. We have a doctor from Saskatchewan, Carrie Barassa. There's Michelle Latimer, Joseph Boyden. The list goes on and on. This is the tip of the iceberg of what's going on here. I know that because the exposés of people like Dr. Turpel-Lafond make it's a bit salacious, right? Makes it sound like everybody gets engaged in the expose aspect, but they're just one of thousands of people who have very recently adopted an Indigenous identity. And I mean tens of thousands of people, perhaps over 100,000. And the other thing about this, Annette, is that it's a growing trend. This is not a small little, this isn't like, one guy gray owl back in the 1920s and 30s. This is thousands and thousands of people who find it to their advantage nowadays to become Indigenous. It's scary.
Why did you feel the need to prepare a report, which is called Indigenous Identity Fraud, for the University of Saskatchewan at this time?
Well, they asked me, so when Dr. Carrie Barassa was sort of the whole story hit the news about her, and she was a very prominent figure in the Indigenous health world. And so head of a lot of, running a lot of services and in charge of dishing out millions and millions of dollars in health research money. So when the expose happened on the CBC, I think it was, the university engaged me to do an employment investigation of her. So it was really an employment investigation into whether she was being honest, not into whether she was Indigenous, but whether she was being honest. And so I started doing that investigation. I interviewed about 60 people, experts and all people in the community in Saskatchewan. And then she resigned. So the university didn't want to lose all that work that I'd been doing. So they asked me to convert the report into sort of a generic report about Indigenous identity fraud, not at all about Dr. Barassa. So that's what happened. And it just happened that they published it right at the time that Dr. Turpel-Lafond's expose came out. That was not planned. I had no idea about that. It just happened at the same time.
One of the things you covered in the report are red flags to watch out for. What are the biggest ones institutions should be watching out for?
The big ones, I would say, are changing stories. We saw this with people like Joseph Boyden. I think over a 10-year period, he identified as something like 11 different Indigenous groups, right? So that's a red flag right away. And when I say red flags, I don't mean that instantly means that they're not Indigenous. It means somebody should be asking questions, right? It's a red flag, and you should. So what we see is sometimes people like 60s scoop survivors who then find out that they're Indigenous. They may wander down the wrong path at first in their attempts to reconnect. So that's why I just say ask questions, because some of the changing stories may be legitimate, but sometimes they're not. So ask questions, changing stories, changing who you're belonging to, big, broad identification. So, and yet normally people don't just say, they might to somebody on the other side of the country say, I'm Tlingit. But if you then the minute somebody says, oh, where are you from? which Indigenous people always do. They'll go, oh, I'm from Taku River, right? So you should be able to zone in on a community, right? And most of us can do that. So I say I'm Métis. Well, yeah, I was born in St. Batel, St. Boniface. I'm your classic Red River Métis, right? So I'm zoning in on a geography. So if people can't do that, if they just go, oh, I'm Mi'kmaq, or they're part of one of these brand new organizations, of which there are hundreds popping up every day, those are all big questions that people should be asking about.
Next week, you'll be a keynote speaker at an Indigenous Citizen Forum put on by the First Nations University of Canada. Can you preview what you'll be telling the audience?
My talk, though, is going to be about consequences, really, about the legal perspectives on this, and trying to just move the conversation forward a little bit, because sometimes people find these, well, they use the word pretendy, and I don't like that term very much, mostly because I think it's too cute, right? Like kids pretend, so it seems like it's harmless when it's just a pretendian. So I don't particularly like the term. But the issue now is, now that people are aware of the issue, especially the academy is aware of the issue is, okay, now what do you do about it? And there's two problems. One is the new people coming in, like students and professors, staff who come in claiming they're Indigenous. So that's the easy problem, because you can just now verify them. The problem, the more serious problem, is what do you do with those who are already embedded in there, got their jobs, have been there for years, maybe have a union, or a tenured professor? How do you deal with those? And I would add that one of the big issues that I think is being ignored right now is government. My assessment is that the federal government and provincial governments are riddled with people who claimed an Indigenous identity in order to get those jobs, and they're not. So I think that's going to be a future site of many, many more exposés, except that the government is sort of taking a duck and cover approach right now, right? You know, keep your head in the sand, and if we just keep doing that, maybe it'll just stay a problem in universities and it won't affect us. But that's not true. There are going to be more and more of these exposés, and my assessment is some of them are going to be very famous people, and it's going to be shocking. There's going to be some icons in the world out there who have been claiming to be Indigenous for years, decades, and they're going to be exposed, and everybody is going to be shocked about it.
Okay. Jean Teillet, we'll leave it there. Miigwech, thank you very much for this.
Miigwech, thank you.
After the break, we'll hear from award-winning hip-hop artist Plex. His latest music video, Red Flags, hits to the heart of this issue. Stay tuned. Ani, welcome back. Before the break, we heard lawyer Jean Teillet identify some of the red flags you should look for when hiring. And during the same month, she tabled her Indigenous identity theft report. This track was dropped by Plex called Red Flags.
Let's finish this, I'm sick of this, calling yourself Indigenous. Don't even know the differences between eagles and pigeons, kid. Lying about who you are, thriving off of who you know. Captain Lou Albino got me rhyming in the studio. Something missing from your claims and that's apparent. There's more native DNA in the tracks you share.
Welcome to Nation, Plex.
Thank you, Nation to Nation, for having me.
So far in the show, we've been talking about using an often false Indigenous identity to further your career. But Red Flags is more than that, correct?
You know, I guess it's an umbrella for many things.
Yeah. Can you mention some of those things it's an umbrella for?
You know, it's just... It originally started out with a little bit of like, you know, beef with a few different pretendians. You know, I was speaking with different women who, you know, have since called out some pretendians and, you know, actually had some people canceled, I guess, or fired or forced into early retirement. So having those conversations, you know, kind of just inspired me to write the song, you know, and even when I'm writing a song, it's how I'm feeling in the moment. It doesn't mean that I'm like necessarily just like always about that topic, but in this case, it's been coming up a lot. It's been the basis of a lot of interviews. So, I mean, I guess I've kind of been labeled or branded an unofficial spokesperson on all things Pretendian. So.
Stop the adoption of an Indigenous identity?
Well, I think we're in the early stages of even identifying it. I think the more that we pry into this conversation, the more Pretendians we're seeing being outed. So I think as time goes on, it's a complex conversation, but as time goes on, we'll probably have a better idea of how it should be handled, how it should be handled, because I think in some cases it's so new to us that, it's difficult for some people not to enter the conversation with anger. And I find that, I'm not angry. I'm amused by the entire thing, but I've witnessed this my entire life. My grandfather worked for Métis urban housing, and I was aware even back then in the 80s that there were people that were abusing, certain services that were allocated for marginalized people. And, I've been aware of it for a long time. And I think it's only become a bigger conversation because you're seeing people in academia or in Hollywood or, and anybody who's receiving something that they could gain as far as maybe funding or bursaries, scholarships, stuff like that. A couple $100,000 a year doesn't hurt, I guess. If you're going to claim anything, I think that, I'm kind of, in one way I'm honored, but at the same time, it's kind of insulting. I've seen other people have the door shut on them when it comes to like grant applications. And then I've seen other people squeak through. So I do think that there needs to be a process to identify who's who.
What's been the response to your song? What are you hearing people say, and have you received any pushback?
Well, it's been overwhelming in the sense that, I'm getting a lot of love for it. So people are, sending me DMs to, kind of congratulate me or thank me for the song. But I'm also seeing on Twitter, I'm getting tagged a lot, people who are pushing back. Usually it's people who I think are just misunderstanding who we're talking about. They think that we're talking about Métis. They think we're talking about white passing natives, but we're actually talking about non-Indigenous people who are claiming an Indigenous identity or basing it on an ancestor that's from the 1600s or the 1700s, which I think is just, I've got Scottish ancestry, but it goes so far back, you don't hear me claiming, wearing a kilt or playing the bagpipes, which I mean, it's an interesting instrument. I'm just not really interested in going that route.
Any new songs in the works in relation to other Indigenous issues?
I do have some other stuff, not really towards Indigenous issues at the moment. I do have a couple more Pretendian songs that will see the light of day, but I think it's important for me to cover a broad spectrum of topics. Currently, Pretendians just seems to be hot right now.
All right, Miigwech Plex. I look forward to seeing some more of your works. Thank you for joining Nation to Nation.
Miigwech.
That's it for the show this week. Don't forget to follow Nation to Nation on social media. And if you missed any parts of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Annette Francis. Good night.